He told her he'd found someone else, but 3 years later, at a glittering charity gala, the Millionaire CEO froze, as a little girl with his eyes hid behind her dress. Dylan West had always believed he understood exactly what he wanted from life: structure, discipline, success, and a partner who fit seamlessly into the image he had constructed for himself. For years this illusion held firm, and he moved through each day as if following a script perfectly tailored for a millionaire CEO. Yet on the day he told Hannah he had found someone else, there was a strange heaviness beneath the confidence in his voice, a weight he couldn't identify, as though part of him knew he was speaking a lie he would only understand much later. The office around them was spotless and polished, the skyline glowing behind vast glass windows, and Hannah stood quietly in the middle of all that cold perfection, a soft, warm contrast that made everything else seem sharper. She didn't interrupt, didn't raise her voice, didn't fight. Her blue eyes, always so bright when she laughed, were calm now, almost too still, and that unnatural stillness made Dylan's stomach twist even as he forced himself to keep his expression unreadable. He expected anger. He expected tears. He expected questions. But Hannah merely inhaled deeply, as though bracing herself against a storm no one else could see. She fiddled with the sleeve of her sweater, an old habit he hadn't realized he memorized, and for a moment he saw the flicker of vulnerability she was trying to hide. It flickered like a candle in wind, brief but real. Then she straightened her shoulders with quiet dignity, and the fragile moment disappeared. She nodded once, that small movement carrying more acceptance and pain than any words could. This simple gesture caught him off guard in a way he didn't fully comprehend, but he refused to let it show. He told himself leaving was best for both of them. He told himself the woman he was now seeing fit the life he had planned, the image he needed. He told himself that Hannah, with her softness and sincerity, would be happier away from the relentless demands of his world. But when she stepped past him and reached for the door, something inside him tightened involuntarily, a brief panic that he smothered before he could understand it. Hannah paused for a heartbeat with her hand on the handle, as if silently taking one last breath before crossing a threshold she could never return from. She didn't glance back. She simply slipped out of the office with a quiet grace that felt like the closing of a chapter neither of them had been ready to end. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence in the office grew impossibly loud. Dylan stood there, surrounded by everything he had ever worked for: success, power, order, and yet he felt strangely hollow, as though something essential had been removed. He tried to shake it off, busying himself with paperwork, messages, and upcoming deadlines, but every task only made the emptiness settle deeper. He convinced himself it was just residual guilt, something that would fade with time. But time didn't soften the strange ache. It only pushed it deeper into him, into a place he wouldn't discover until it was too late. Hannah left the city before dawn, carrying nothing but a single suitcase, her purse, and the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. The bus station smelled of coffee, cold metal, and exhaustion, and she felt strangely invisible as she bought her ticket with trembling hands. No one cared that she was leaving behind a man she had once imagined forever with. No one noticed the way she kept pressing her palm against her stomach as if trying to quiet something fragile inside her. The bus hissed as it arrived, and when the doors opened, she stepped inside without allowing herself even a backward glance, terrified that if she looked at the city she had called home, she would lose the strength to leave it. She found a seat by the window, pulled her knees close, and watched the skyscrapers slowly dissolve into distance. The farther she went, the more her chest burned with a mixture of heartbreak, confusion, and something that felt very close to freedom. The new town greeted her with salty air, narrow streets, and the soft roar of waves crashing against the shore. She rented the cheapest studio she could find, peeling wallpaper, noisy neighbors, a heater that rattled at night, but it was hers, untouched by Dylan's shadow. She took whatever jobs she could, clearing tables at a cafe, cleaning offices in the evenings, helping unpack stock at a small art store. Each day she returned home exhausted, her hands sore, her back throbbing, yet there was a quiet strength rising inside her that she hadn't felt in years. She was surviving without him. She was rebuilding. She was learning how strong she truly was, even as loneliness settled like dust in the corners of her days. But 2 weeks after settling in, everything changed again. She had been washing her face late at night when she caught sight of herself in the mirror, paler than usual, tired, but somehow different. Her breath sharpened. She counted the days, and then counted them again. The realization hit her so hard she had to grip the sink to stay on her feet. The next morning, she bought a test at a small pharmacy on the corner, and her fingers shook as she carried the small box back to her studio. She sat on her bed for a long time before opening it, as if delaying the inevitable truth. When the result appeared, her heart thundered in her chest in a way she had never experienced. She was pregnant. The room seemed to tilt slightly as she stared at the result, the truth echoing loudly in her ears. She cried, quietly at first, then uncontrollably, pressing her hand over her mouth to muffle the sobs. Not because she regretted the life growing inside her, but because she suddenly felt the weight of every fear, every unknown, every long road ahead. She thought of Dylan, of the way he had stood in his office with that cold finality in his eyes. She thought of the woman he'd chosen instead of her. She thought of the life she'd once imagined with him, and how violently it had unraveled. For a fleeting moment, she imagined calling him, telling him the truth, hearing him say something, anything, that would help her breathe again. But then she remembered his voice, the certainty in the words, "I've found someone else," and she knew he had made his choice long before she even knew she was carrying his child. When the storm of emotion finally subsided, she wiped her cheeks and placed a gentle hand over her stomach. In that moment, something within her shifted. The tears dried, replaced by a fierce, protective warmth she hadn't expected. This child wasn't a mistake. This child wasn't a burden. This child was hers. And she would fight for this tiny heartbeat with everything she had. She whispered softly into the stillness of the room, promising the little life inside her that she would be enough, that they would build a future together, whether anyone else stood beside them or not. It was the beginning of a different kind of strength, one she had never needed before, but one she would now depend on for every day to come. Hannah's pregnancy unfolded like a long, uneven road, quiet stretches of calm suddenly interrupted by moments of fear so sharp they stole her breath. The small coastal town, which had first seemed like a temporary refuge, slowly transformed into a place where she could breathe without constantly fearing she might run into the man who had broken her. Her days started early, often before sunrise, when she would sit at the small table by her window and sip warm tea, watching fishermen preparing their boats, listening to the seagulls calling over the water. Those quiet mornings became her anchor, the only time she allowed herself to truly feel everything simmering inside her. She would press her palms against her growing belly and imagine the tiny heartbeat inside, trying to picture the face of the child she would soon meet. Work became more difficult as her belly grew. Carrying trays at the cafe left her breathless, bending to pick up supplies at the art shop sent sharp aches through her back, and her cleaning shifts became nearly impossible. Yet she pushed through each day with stubborn determination, refusing to let fear dictate her decisions. Her co-workers noticed her slower movements but never asked questions, and she was grateful for that quiet respect. The one person who did show concern was the elderly owner of the art shop, Mrs. Greaves, whose gentle eyes missed nothing. One evening, after watching Hannah rub her lower back for the 10th time, she simply said, "If you ever need help, dear, you come to me." It wasn't pity, it was understanding, carved from years of her own experience. That single sentence made Hannah feel seen in a way she hadn't felt since she left the city. The doctor's visits were modest, with outdated equipment and creaky chairs, but the doctor himself was kind and patient. He explained each stage of the pregnancy slowly, making sure she understood everything, and when the monitor first revealed the faint outline of her baby, Hannah felt her world tilt. She stared at the grainy image, hardly daring to breathe, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered hello to the little person who had already become the center of her universe. She walked home afterward with the image clutched to her chest, terrified of folding it wrong or losing it. Every few minutes she stopped simply to look at it again, smiling through fresh tears. The months passed, and her life settled into a rhythm built around preparation. She saved every spare dollar, skipping small comforts so she could buy a used crib from a neighbor and a few soft blankets from a thrift store. She learned how to knit from an online video and made tiny hats in neutral colors, whispering to herself that the child would forgive her for the uneven stitches. At night, she sat near the window with her hands resting on her belly, humming quietly as the baby kicked gently, as if responding to her voice. Those moments strengthened her in ways she never expected. Every kick reminded her that she was not alone, that she was building a future even if the road behind her had collapsed. But there were darker nights too, nights when the wind howled against the thin walls of her studio and doubts rushed in like a tide she couldn't hold back. She wondered whether she would be enough, whether she could give her child the life they deserved, whether she would ever stop aching from the way Dylan had dismissed her so easily. She wondered what he would say if he knew she was carrying his child. Sometimes she imagined him calling, apologizing, asking her to return. Other times she imagined him laughing, confirming every fear she tried to bury. She fought those thoughts fiercely, refusing to let them steal the hope she was nurturing for her baby. When labor came, it arrived in a way that felt impossibly sudden, yet inevitable. She woke one early morning to a sharp pain that rippled through her body, stealing her breath. For a moment, she lay frozen in the dim light of her room, listening to the waves break outside as the pain surged again. She reached for her bag, already packed weeks earlier, and made her way to the small clinic, her steps slow but steady. The nurses recognized her instantly and rushed to help, guiding her into a room with warm lighting and soft voices. The hours blurred into a mixture of pain, sweat, whispered encouragement, and pure determination. And then, in a moment that felt suspended outside of time, her daughter entered the world. The first cry was tiny but fierce, and when the nurse placed the baby in her arms, Hannah felt her heart bloom open in a way that made every hardship, every lonely night, every moment of fear dissolve into nothing. She stared down at Brooke, her dark hair damp and soft, her warm brown eyes blinking up with quiet curiosity, and felt the deepest certainty she had ever known. This child was her purpose, her future, her strength in human form. She kissed the tiny forehead, inhaling the newness, and whispered promises only a mother could make. In that small, quiet room, illuminated by the soft morning light, Hannah realized she hadn't lost everything the day she left Dylan. Instead, she had found the beginning of a new life, one she would learn to build, protect, and cherish with every piece of her heart. Brooke's first 3 years unfolded like a long, gentle sunrise, slow and glowing and full of moments Hannah wished she could bottle forever. Motherhood reshaped her days completely, turning the small coastal town into a world of routines built around tiny footsteps, soft giggles, and endless discoveries. Their studio apartment remained cramped and worn, but it was filled with warmth, markers scattered across the table, little socks drying by the window, children's books stacked on the nightstand. The walls that once echoed with silence now held Brooke's babbling, her squeals of delight when she learned to stand, her soft humming when Hannah rocked her to sleep. The exhaustion was constant, but it came with a sweetness that made it feel meaningful rather than burdensome. Hannah often woke before sunrise, not because she had to work, but because Brooke kicked in her sleep and murmured softly, as if dreaming her way into the day. By the time Brooke turned 1, she already showed her own personality. She was observant, with a quiet intelligence that made her pause before touching new things, as if studying them from every angle. When Hannah took her to the beach on weekends, Brooke would sit in the sand for long stretches, running her small fingers through the grains, tilting her head as though she were absorbing some ancient wisdom hidden in the ocean breeze. Other children would rush into the water, scream, laugh, push each other, but Brooke preferred to stay close, pressing her cheek to her mother's knee while listening to the waves. The townspeople adored her. The regulars at the cafe where Hannah sometimes worked would slip her bits of fresh fruit or draw little doodles on napkins to make her smile. Even strangers paused to compliment her dark hair and deep brown eyes, which glowed with a warmth that invited affection. Hannah watched her daughter grow with a sense of awe she never got used to. Each new milestone felt like a victory. They celebrated her first step with clapping and laughter in the tiny living room, her first word whispered into the quiet of a late evening, her first drawing made with a crayon so worn it stained their fingers. Hannah took photos when she could, not of grand events but of small moments: Brooke reaching for a flower, Brooke hugging her stuffed rabbit, Brooke falling asleep with paint on her hands after a messy afternoon of creativity. These snapshots became Hannah's treasures, physical proof of the life she was building. Financially, life remained tight, but it was no longer frightening. After noticing how quickly Brooke gravitated toward art supplies, Mrs. Greaves at the art shop began letting Hannah bring her to the studio during slow hours. At first, Brooke simply sat quietly on the floor, doodling while her mother organized shelves or cleaned brushes. But soon, the teachers noticed how still she became when watching them work, her wide eyes following every movement as they mixed colors or shaped clay. One afternoon, when a teacher offered her a small slab of clay, Brooke touched it with a seriousness far beyond her years and gently pressed her tiny hand into it. The mark stayed there, a small imprint that made the adults exchange surprised glances. Hannah tucked the piece of clay into her bag that night, as proud as if Brooke had won a national award. Those first years also brought new friends, other mothers who lived nearby, a retired couple who lived downstairs and loved babysitting, and even a few coworkers who treated Brooke like a niece. From them, Hannah learned how to navigate tantrums, teething, sleepless nights, and unexpected fevers. She learned how to be both strong and soft at the same time, how to protect Brooke without smothering her, and how to accept help without feeling ashamed of needing it. Despite everything, she never once regretted her decision to leave the city, never once wished she had told Dylan the truth. In her mind, their chapter was closed. But there were quiet nights when memories drifted in uninvited. On those nights, after Brooke had fallen asleep, Hannah would find herself staring out the window, the moonlight catching in her hair as she wondered whether Dylan ever thought of her. She wondered whether he had married the woman he claimed he'd found. She wondered whether he would have wanted their child, whether he would have loved Brooke's soft laugh or the way she wrinkled her nose when concentrating. The thought always hurt, sharp and deep, but it was no longer unbearable. Time had reshaped her heartbreak into something muted, a faint ache rather than an open wound. The turning point came when Brooke was 3. By then she was a curious, bright little girl who rarely let go of her mother's hand in public but had begun exploring the world with more confidence at home. Her vocabulary grew, her laughter became louder, and her drawings more detailed. Hannah knew they were ready for something new, something bigger. When she was offered a part-time assistant position at the art studio, stable hours, slightly better pay, and the ability to bring Brooke when necessary, she accepted without hesitation. Walking into the studio on her first official day, with Brooke holding her hand and studying everything with wide eyes, Hannah felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope for a future she hadn't planned, but one she was finally ready to embrace. She didn't know that fate was moving toward her from another direction as well. She didn't know that 3 years after she walked out of a CEO's office with dignity and a broken heart, that same CEO was about to collide with her world again in a way neither of them could have predicted. For now, though, in that small coastal town filled with sea air and sunlight, mother and daughter lived peacefully, unaware that their quiet life was standing on the edge of a storm that would change everything. By the 4th year after Hannah left, Dylan West's life had transformed into a polished, expensive performance, one he delivered flawlessly to the world but never truly lived within. His days were defined by sharp schedules, crisp suits, business meetings that blurred together, and a carefully maintained public image. To the outside world, he appeared even more successful than before, the youngest CEO in the company's history, a man who had everything: power, wealth, and a woman on his arm who fit the part of a CEO's partner perfectly. But if anyone looked closely, they would have noticed something subtly off in the way he carried himself. His eyes, once filled with fire and ambition, now held a constant flicker of restlessness, as though he were forever searching for something he couldn't name. His relationship with Caroline had settled into a predictable rhythm. She was beautiful, intelligent, and knew exactly how to behave in the circles he operated in. Her dark hair and icy blue eyes never failed to draw attention, and she navigated high society events with effortless grace. Yet their connection was hollow. He felt it when they sat across from each other at dinner, her laughter too sharp, her compliments too rehearsed. She loved the lifestyle, the access, the cameras, everything that came with being linked to Dylan West. But she didn't love him. And deep down, he knew he didn't love her either. Their relationship was convenient, expected, visually pleasing but emotionally barren. He sometimes caught himself remembering the way Hannah used to talk with her hands, or how she listened so attentively his heart felt strangely full afterward. Caroline didn't listen, she waited for her turn to speak. Hannah's smile had been soft and unguarded, Caroline's was sharp, perfected through years of posing for photos. Worse yet, Caroline sensed the undercurrent of dissatisfaction and responded with subtle pressure, suggesting engagements, hinting at shared apartments, sending pictures of rings, just for fun. Dylan always deflected the conversation, telling himself he was simply not ready for marriage. What he didn't admit, even in his own mind, was that deep inside him lived the memory of a woman he couldn't forget no matter how much time passed. The charity foundation Dylan sponsored annually had become one of the few events he genuinely looked forward to. It allowed him to step outside the rigid world of corporate expectations and into a space where people sought to create meaningful change. Hosting the gala each year gave him a sense of purpose, a reminder that life wasn't solely about numbers and profits. And yet, even these events had started feeling dull lately, drained of authenticity by social climbers and investors more interested in selfies than charity. Caroline adored the galas, because they offered her a perfect stage, but Dylan increasingly felt like he was watching his own life from a distance. In the weeks leading up to the upcoming gala, he found himself distracted in meetings, forgetting appointments, losing focus during presentations. His assistant even asked if he was feeling unwell. But the truth was more complicated, he was haunted by a strange emptiness that clung to him like fog. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about the moment Hannah walked out of his office, how calm she looked, how heavy the silence felt after she closed the door. He didn't understand why that memory resurfaced so vividly after so many years, but he often found himself imagining her life now. Had she moved on? Was she married? Did she ever think of him? Did she hate him? The questions gnawed at him like small, invisible teeth. He never told Caroline about Hannah. Not because he was hiding anything intentionally, but because the subject felt too personal, too real for a relationship built on surface-level compatibility. Caroline existed in the world of presentations and appearances, Hannah belonged to a softer world he had once touched but let slip through his fingers. On the night of the gala, Dylan dressed in a tailored navy suit, fastened his cufflinks with mechanical movements, and looked at his reflection in the mirror. He saw a man who had everything, yet nothing in his expression reflected fulfillment. Caroline appeared behind him, adjusting her earrings, complimenting his appearance with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They walked into the shimmering ballroom together, a perfect couple, or so it appeared to everyone who greeted them. But as Dylan moved through the crowd, something felt different this year. A strange tension pulled at him, as if life itself were holding its breath. He couldn't explain it, only sense it, a shift in the air, an unseen force drawing him toward something he couldn't yet see. He greeted guests, shook hands, smiled when expected to, but a quiet, persistent unease followed him like a shadow. Caroline, too focused on photographers and acquaintances, didn't notice his distraction. Dylan didn't know that there was someone else in the ballroom that night, someone who would shatter the fragile balance he had been maintaining for years. Someone who had carried a piece of him away the moment she walked out of his life. Someone who would make everything he thought he knew collapse in a single heartbeat. In just a few minutes, his perfectly structured world would tilt, his past would collide with his present, and the future he had never dared to imagine would begin unraveling right before his eyes. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, each crystal catching light like a falling star. The music flowed through the room in smooth currents, mingling with soft laughter, clinking glasses, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Hannah stepped inside with careful, measured breaths, holding Brooke's small hand in her own as the little girl stared wide-eyed at the glittering surroundings. For a moment Hannah felt as though she had stepped into a world she no longer belonged to, a world of wealth and polished perfection, a world she once brushed the edges of but never truly entered. Her simple ivory dress contrasted sharply with the jeweled gowns around her, but she held her head high, determined not to let insecurity unravel her. The studio where she worked had been invited to display artwork created by children from low-income families, and Hannah had helped organize the exhibit. She couldn't refuse the invitation, even if it terrified her. Brooke clung to her side, her dark hair tied neatly with a small bow, her warm brown eyes darting around in curiosity. Hannah knelt and smoothed a stray curl behind the little girl's ear, whispering reassurance. "Stay close to me, sweetheart. There are a lot of people here." Brooke nodded timidly, her fingers tightening around her mother's. The child was used to quiet spaces, beaches, parks, cozy corners of the art studio, not glittering rooms filled with strangers. Hannah kissed her forehead, then guided her toward the section where children's artwork was being set up. She tried to focus on the task, arranging drawings and straightening name tags while speaking politely to other volunteers. Yet there was a strange pressure building under her ribs, a faint sense of being watched. She dismissed it at first, telling herself she was simply nervous. It had been years since she had stepped into a crowd of wealthy elites, and the sight of so many confident, polished faces stirred memories she had fought to bury. She reminded herself that she didn't know anyone here, that no one would recognize her, that she was safe. But the tightness in her chest remained. Across the ballroom, Dylan was moving through the crowd with rigid politeness, shaking hands, making conversation, smiling when necessary. Caroline hung onto his arm, laughing brightly, soaking up the attention. But Dylan wasn't fully present. Something inside him felt oddly unsettled, as though the air had shifted and he had stepped into a moment he couldn't yet see. He paused near a table, scanning the room without knowing what he was searching for. His gaze drifted over the crowd, until it caught on a familiar silhouette near the far wall. Hannah. The name struck him like lightning. He blinked, certain he was imagining her, but she didn't disappear. She stood with her back partly turned, adjusting artwork on a display board, her blonde hair falling gently down her back. The soft curve of her shoulders, the graceful way she moved, the quiet steadiness of her presence, everything about her was unmistakable. His heart lurched, then pounded with a force that left him almost breathless. Caroline noticed his sudden stillness. "Dylan? What is it?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. His gaze was locked on Hannah as though she were the only real thing in the room. And then he saw the child. A small girl stood beside her, her tiny hand gripping Hannah's dress. She wore a pale bow in her dark hair, and her warm brown eyes scanned the crowd with the same careful curiosity Hannah used to have. At first Dylan felt only confusion, then something in the child's face shifted, some angle of her expression catching the light just right, revealing a familiarity so sharp it cut him. The shape of her eyes. The softness of her features. The delicate curve of her nose. The way she held her mouth when uncertain. It was like looking into a mirror of his own childhood photographs. His breath hitched. His grip tightened around the glass he was holding until his knuckles turned white. His mind raced back through years of memories, Hannah's sudden departure, her silence, the hollow ache that had never fully left him. He had assumed she disappeared because she wanted nothing to do with him. He had never imagined another possibility. Never imagined that something more, someone more, had existed in the space between them. He set his glass down, his pulse roaring loud in his ears. Without responding to Caroline's questions, he began moving across the room, his steps unsteady, his heart slamming against his ribs as if trying to break free. With each step, the distance between him and Hannah shrank, but the weight of the truth grew heavier. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know what explanation he could offer. He didn't even know if she would look at him. But he knew he had to reach her. Hannah sensed movement behind her, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made the tiny hairs on her arms rise. She turned halfway, Brooke pressed against her leg, and her breath stopped. Dylan stood only a few feet away, staring at her with a look of disbelief so raw it almost hurt to see. His face had changed, older, sharper, more tired, but his eyes were the same dark brown she once loved enough to forgive anything. Their gazes collided, and for a moment the world around them dissolved. She froze. Her heart hammered violently, her throat tightened, and her body felt split between the urge to run and the urge to crumble. Brooke sensed the tension and stepped even closer, gripping her mother's leg with both hands. Dylan's gaze flicked down to the child, and Hannah saw the exact second recognition struck him. His face drained of color, his jaw slackened, and pain, deep, overwhelming pain, rippled across his expression. Everything inside Hannah twisted. She had prepared for the possibility of seeing him someday, but she hadn't prepared for this, for him witnessing her daughter, for him realizing exactly what he had lost, for the truth to cut through both of them like a blade. Dylan opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again, his voice breaking. "Hannah." She swallowed hard, forcing her breathing into something steady, reminding herself that Brooke was watching. Her daughter didn't need fear. She needed strength. Hannah placed a gentle hand on Brooke's shoulder and faced him with as much composure as she could gather. In that charged moment, heavy with shock and history and unspoken truths, the entire room around them buzzed quietly, unaware that two lives, and one small child's future, were about to collide in a way none of them could have foreseen. And Dylan, staring at the little girl who looked so achingly like him, felt something inside him crack wide open for the first time in years. For a long moment Dylan stood speechless, as though words had deserted him entirely. The noise of the gala faded into a distant hum, and all he could hear was the frantic rush of his pulse in his ears as he stared at the small girl clinging protectively to Hannah's leg. Brooke blinked up at him with cautious curiosity, her dark brown eyes wide and alert, her small fingers curling into the fabric of her mother's dress. Dylan felt something inside him tear, not violently but slowly and painfully, like a seam that had been strained for years and finally gave way. He had imagined Hannah with someone else after she left, pictured her smiling at another man or building a quiet life far from him. He had never imagined this, a child who bore his features so clearly that denial was impossible. Hannah shifted slightly, instinctively placing herself just a bit more in front of Brooke, and the protective gesture struck him with unexpected force. It reminded him that Hannah had done everything alone: the pregnancy, the birth, the long nights, the first steps, the first words, the milestones he didn't even know he had missed. He swallowed hard, trying to find words that didn't feel shallow or weak. "Hannah," he said again, softer this time, as if saying her name gently might undo the years between them. His voice trembled despite his efforts, and he saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes, wariness, strength, and something he couldn't read anymore. She straightened, lifting her chin. "Dylan," she replied calmly, her tone polite but distant, the kind of voice someone uses with a stranger they don't trust. Her gaze didn't waver, even though he saw the subtle tension in her posture. She was ready to defend herself and her child if needed, and the realization made his throat tighten painfully. He wished he could erase every reason she had to stand so guarded before him, but regret was a useless cure for wounds already formed. He looked at Brooke again, his heart clenching. "Is she?" He didn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. Hannah hesitated, glancing down at her daughter, and in that hesitation Dylan felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing onto his chest. Then she nodded once, resolutely, without dramatics or trembling. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "She's your daughter." The words hit him harder than any accusation ever had. He felt his knees weaken, and the polished, perfect world he had built around himself wobbled at the edges, threatening to collapse entirely. His vision blurred for a moment as he tried to absorb the truth. 3 years. 3 entire years of her life passed without him even knowing she existed. Every breath he took felt shallow, almost painful. He knelt slowly, not caring that people in the room were beginning to watch or whisper or look confused. His expensive suit, his status, his carefully constructed image, all of it meant nothing now. He knelt because it was the only way he could look his daughter in the eyes without towering over her like a stranger. Brooke stared at him cautiously, her tiny fingers tightening on Hannah's dress. Dylan cleared his throat gently, trying to steady his shaking voice. "Hi," he said, speaking softly as though addressing the most delicate piece of porcelain. "My name is..." He paused, because saying his name suddenly felt inadequate. I'm Dylan." Brooke blinked up at him, studying him with a seriousness rare for a child her age. She didn't step forward, but she didn't hide either. Her gaze traveled from his eyes to his hands, to his expression, as though she were trying to decide whether he was safe. Then she leaned her cheek lightly against her mother's thigh, a small gesture that made Hannah's heart ache and Dylan's chest tighten even more. She wasn't rejecting him, she was simply trying to understand him, and he didn't deserve even that much grace from her. He looked up at Hannah, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't angry, it was wounded, desperate, filled with a sorrow that seemed to hollow out his words. Hannah inhaled slowly, drawing in courage before she replied. "Because you made your choice," she said simply, not with bitterness but with truth. "You told me you found someone else. You closed the door. And I didn't want my child to grow up in a place where she was unwanted." The memory of that moment crashed into him like a tidal wave, the cold certainty in his own voice, the way he had convinced himself he was doing the right thing even though something in him twisted the second she walked away. He hadn't known what that feeling was then, but now he did. It had been loss. Foolish, avoidable loss. And now he was staring at the living proof of what his decision had cost him. He pressed a hand against his forehead, fighting the urge to crumble. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Hannah, I swear, I didn't know." His voice cracked, and the rawness in it broke something fragile in her. She'd prepared herself to face anger or defensiveness from him, not this devastating vulnerability. Hannah glanced down at Brooke again, smoothing her hair gently. "I wasn't going to chase someone who had already walked away," she said with quiet firmness. "I chose to build a life for her. A safe, peaceful one." Her eyes met his again, and he saw no accusation there, just the truth of her experience. That hurt even more. "Can I?" His voice faltered. He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "Can I be in her life?" The question hung between them, heavy with fear. For the first time, Dylan wasn't asking as a CEO, or as the confident man he always presented to the world. He was asking as someone who realized he had already missed too much. Hannah hesitated, not out of spite but out of caution, for Brooke, for herself, for the fragile future that might form ahead. She studied him carefully, searching for sincerity beyond guilt. She saw desperation, yes, but she also saw remorse, humility, and a kind of tenderness she had never witnessed in him before. It was not an attempt to reclaim her, this was about the child who stood half-hidden behind her. Brooke peeked up at them again, her small fingers loosening slightly, her dark eyes curious but not afraid. Hannah exhaled slowly. "We'll talk," she said at last. Not a promise, not rejection, just a beginning. Dylan closed his eyes, relief and heartbreak colliding inside him with enough force to make him unsteady. When he opened them again, he looked at his daughter, and for the first time in his life, his world aligned not around ambition or power, but around a small child with warm brown eyes who had no idea how completely she had just changed him. In the days that followed the gala, life became a careful balance of uncertainty, hope, and slow, tentative steps towards something neither Hannah nor Dylan had expected. The encounter had left the air between them charged with questions, unanswered, delicate, and emotionally heavy, but it also stirred something new, the possibility of rewriting their story, not as lovers stumbling through heartbreak, but as two parents trying to build a bridge for a little girl who never asked for the chaos that created her. Hannah found herself replaying the moment of revelation again and again, not because she wanted to reopen old wounds, but because seeing Dylan's raw reaction had shaken her. She had expected cold confusion or defensive anger, but what she saw instead was devastation that seemed to reach into his very bones. It was the look of a man who had been confronted with the cost of his past choices and realized too late how immense that cost truly was. Brooke, young as she was, sensed something had changed. She became more watchful, studying her mother's face when she thought Hannah wasn't looking, asking fewer questions than expected for a child encountering someone who seemed so intensely interested in her. She remained close, anchored by the familiarity of her mother's presence, but she didn't show fear. She simply absorbed the world in that quiet, thoughtful way she always had, storing pieces in her mind like puzzle fragments she would assemble when ready. Hannah found comfort in that, even when her own emotions tangled painfully. Dylan, meanwhile, struggled to navigate a life that suddenly felt unbearably hollow without any place for Brooke in it yet. He returned home from the gala with Caroline demanding explanations he refused to give, and by morning their relationship had cracked beyond repair. She sensed the shift instantly. A woman like her always knew when she was no longer the center of someone's attention, and she walked out of his penthouse in a storm of indignation and disbelief. Dylan didn't stop her. For the first time, he understood the difference between losing something convenient and realizing he had lost something irreplaceable. He spent nights staring at the ceiling, sleepless and haunted by the thought of a child who had taken her first steps without him, said her first word without him, laughed and cried and groaned under the care of a woman he had once pushed away. The guilt was suffocating, but deeper still was the longing, a yearning so fierce it left him breathless. He wanted to know her. He needed to know her. Not out of obligation, but out of a growing love he didn't yet understand how to hold. It took Hannah 3 days to respond to his message, an earnest, trembling apology in which every sentence seemed carved from regret. She didn't answer immediately because she needed time to understand what was best for Brooke, not what felt easiest for her own heart. When she finally agreed to meet in a quiet park overlooking the shoreline, she arrived early, Brooke's small hand wrapped tightly in hers. The little girl wore her favorite pale sweater and clutched her stuffed rabbit against her chest, looking up every so often as if checking whether her mother was sure about this meeting. Hannah knelt beside her, brushing her cheek gently, whispering that she would never let anything bad happen. Brooke nodded, trusting her completely. When Dylan arrived, he seemed different, less polished, less invincible, more human. The wind tousled his dark hair, his eyes held a depth of emotion he couldn't hide, and his steps faltered slightly when he saw Brooke. He approached slowly, careful not to overwhelm her, and knelt a respectful distance away. The moment stretched quietly between them, his gaze softening as Brooke stared back with somber curiosity. He didn't try to touch her, didn't force a smile or attempt to reach for her. He simply spoke in a gentle, steady voice that seemed to vibrate with sincerity. "Hi, Brooke. I'm glad you came." Brooke tilted her head and considered him the way she considered seashells on the beach before deciding which ones to pick up. Hannah watched the interaction with her heart in her throat, marveling at how much care Dylan poured into a single greeting. Finally, Brooke stepped half a pace closer, not out of trust but out of openness, and held out her stuffed rabbit for him to see. He blinked, stunned by the gesture, and nodded as though she had handed him something precious. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking. Brooke retreated back to her mother but kept her eyes on him, assessing him quietly. They talked then, not all three together at first, but in slow layers. Hannah told him about the pregnancy, the birth, the early years, the laughter and difficulties, the nights she stayed awake terrified she wasn't enough. Dylan listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from grief to awe to shame as he absorbed every detail of a life he had missed. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I want to know her. I want to earn the right to be her father. Not by asking for forgiveness, but by becoming someone she can rely on." It wasn't a promise thrown recklessly into the air. It was a vow rooted in humility. Over the next weeks, their meetings continued. Sometimes Dylan joined them at the park, sometimes at the art studio, sometimes for short walks along the shore where Brooke collected tiny shells and quietly slipped her hand into his when she thought he wasn't paying attention. With each small moment, Dylan's presence became less foreign, and Brooke began treating him not as a stranger but as someone familiar, someone safe enough to share pieces of her world with. As she grew comfortable, Hannah started noticing something she hadn't expected. Dylan wasn't pushing for reconciliation romantically. He wasn't trying to reclaim a lost relationship or sweep her back into his life. He was focused entirely on Brooke, on learning her favorite foods, her bedtime routines, the stories that soothed her fears, the games that made her giggle uncontrollably. Watching them together softened Hannah in ways she didn't anticipate, awakening feelings she had buried long ago. But she didn't act on them, not yet, not until trust was rebuilt slowly, deliberately, the way strong foundations always are. The day Brooke fell asleep in Dylan's arms for the first time, her small head resting against his shoulder, her breath soft and even, Hannah felt something shift permanently. He looked up at her with eyes that glistened, overwhelmed by the weight of being chosen, truly chosen, by a child who had every reason to hesitate. Hannah sat beside him, silence flowing comfortably between them as the wind rustled the trees and waves murmured against the shore. In that moment, she realized something simple and profound. She no longer saw the man who once pushed her away. She saw a father learning how to love with his whole heart, a man humbled by loss and transformed by the fragile hands now curled against his chest. Their future was uncertain, not yet defined by labels or commitments, but it was open in a way that held warmth instead of pain, hope instead of fear. And as Brooke slept peacefully between them, Hannah felt, for the first time in years, that she wasn't standing at the edge of a storm anymore. She was standing at the beginning of something new, slow, fragile, beautiful, and she was no longer afraid to step into it.